we are an African country and a developing country. This is our characteristic when we engage with other countries. I think South Africa is a European country. Accident is at the bottom of the continent. That's why we first and foremost an Asian country. And from there flows our views on things. And we have a right as a sovereign state to hold particular views. The minister spoke to the elements of our national interest, in particular the Constitution, which is very explicit in laying an interest when it comes to human rights. We do, but the potential impact of what we do on all of these rights is an indivisible package. And here's where, when we take this approach of national interest, we're going to with the United States of America. They don't believe in anything like socioeconomic rights. They don't exist, they say. We once had a delegation coming to sort us out here, yet our constitution is categorical about socioeconomic rights. And not only that, they're justiciable. When the Constitutional Court said of the Sasa case, there are rights that are so precarious that they can never be left in the hands of the private sector. That was an instruction that underpins how we view or what we do in terms of diplomacy. It sets a red line for us, as it were. And so we hope at the end of the day we'll come out, I think, with like common sense. What helps us as diplomats is like common grammar as a point of reference. We have a syntax that encompasses all of this, because at the end of the day, everything, language matters in diplomacy. Language matters, and there are subtexts. And all of these subtexts and language embody in the multilateral area the national interests of different blocs. So when Europe talks about gender, we know we need to get clarity. What exactly are you talking about on gender? When they talk about human rights defenders, we need to know what exactly they're talking about, because we need to be able, or we already know, because we know their characteristic. What kind of a bloc is this? What drives this bloc? It is their survival. It's their dominance, their ability to shape the world. Minister, this symposium takes place at a time of shifts in the global arena. In the multilateral arena, even before COVID, were unleashing. It was as if everything that we knew was up for grabs. And the simple bifurcation of it is that we, as developing countries, as South Africa, need from the world an order that will support our ambitions as articulated in the Constitution, ensure that we achieve poverty eradication, job creation, and address the income inequalities. Whereby what our counterparts need are things that will ensure sustainable recovery as distinct from development. South Africa is a developing country, as I said, and an African country at that too. Our fate is intertwined with the fate of the continent. So with that, as I said, the minister gave an extensive, I think, opening and set the context. And I hope that the discussion will enrich us and arm us to be sharper in how we proceed forward. Our history can never be forgotten. attitude of struggle. It shapes our thinking. I think some of us, as Ambassador Wegley probably might share later, we intuitively respond to injustice, and as former underdogs, we feel it's imperative for us to champion the fate of those that are in a similar situation that we're in Western Sahara. And right. With that, Minister, let me introduce, we are fortunate to have Dr. Mete, who's going to achievement of South Africa's national interest. Professor Zondi, who's going to talk about shifts in global institutional alliances. And then Mr. Singh, Dr. Mete is from the University of Pretoria. Professor Zondi is from the University of Johannesburg. Mr. Singh is from the Institute for Security Studies, and will speak on the development of South Africa's national interest and foreign policy. And Professor Mdletyana from the University of Johannesburg will talk on national sovereignty and constitutional order. I usually say to people, we are the proper sovereign state, we're not a total state. And as sovereign states have got national interests. And so with that, without any further delays, let me hand over to Dr. Mbete.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here, Minister Pandlo. We look forward to pay our due respect to your Excellency. It's wonderful to be here with you today. I have been given the unenviable task of speaking first on the panel and reflecting on the risks to the achievement of South Africa's national interest. In reading the national interest document and in reflecting on how to frame the risks to the national interest, and especially of the spending will be risks, and separate to the fifth, which is the global context. And I will explain why I get those two separate. Before I begin, I'd just like to give some context. Last week, the Stats SA released their population statistics after the recent census, and South Africa's population now sits at 60.6 million people. Of those 60.6 million people, 30 million are youth. The median age of South Africans is 28. 51.5% of South Africans are female, 81% are Black African, and there is a youth bulge between the ages of 25 to 39. So the largest demographic of the South African population is between the ages of 25 and 39. Of those 60.6 million South Africans, 55.5% live below the upper bound poverty line of about 1,300 rand per person per month. So when we speak about the national interest, that is the nation of which we speak. And I think that's important to keep top of mind when we think about, firstly, whose national interest are we speaking of, and when we think of what the possible threats then to that national interest could be. In the national interest document, Miroslav Lenincic, I think would be how I pronounce it, is quoted in that he contends that there are three principles that should be satisfied in developing an unbiased conception of national interest, and those three are inclusiveness, exclusiveness, and external relevance. The inclusiveness principle is that the national interest should consider the nation as Inclusiveness Principle refers to a state seeking the national interest when it is not concerned with the interests of any groups outside domestic interests. This implies that the interests being pursued should at all times be related to the interests at home and not those of any group outside of its jurisdiction or territorial control. According to the external relevance being affected by the international environment and consequently by the conduct of foreign affairs. In slight deviation to this framework, I am going to begin by identifying as a major risk to the national interests socioeconomic factors, which could be framed as being domestic issues, but which I think pose a serious threat to many of the aspects of the national interest defined in this document, particularly those around solidarity, around African solidarity, African development, and South Africa's identity as an African country. The first one, and I think the most important and critical one, is unemployment. South Africa's unemployment crisis is the greatest threat to South Africa's national interest and its sustainability as a sovereign state. Particularly the increase in youth unemployment is a threat to the stability of South Africa as a sovereign state and the achievement of South African national interests. And the first quarter of 2022, youth unemployment amongst young graduates was at 32.6%. Over 40% of young South Africans under the age of 35 are not in employment, education, or training. In many countries, unemployment hitting 5% or 6% or 8% is an emergency and something that needs to be dealt with. I recently was doing research on Zambia and motivations for young people to turn out to vote in last year's election, and bringing in the new PND government. And Zambian unemployment had reached 11%. And it was at such crisis levels that young people turned out at huge numbers to vote the incumbent government out. 11%, another SADC country, I'm not talking about Europe or Asia, one of our neighbors. So there is, I would argue, no way of trying to conceptualize the national interest without centering the unemployment crisis. And I like the framing of this document, the characterization of this document as a framework document that informs policy. And as such, I think that all of our policies, whether they be education or economic, or housing or transport, should have at their center addressing the unemployment crisis facing South Africa. And this isn't a question. It was interesting listening to politicians over the weekend framing this as ensuring the future of South Africa, the future of South African youth. This is a present problem. It's not a future one. It's right here and now. And it's a problem that then is linked to issues like very high rates of crime. It is linked to and directly related to this particular document and the emphasis on South Africa's interest being Africa's interest in African development is the extremely dangerous levels of anti-African xenophobia. I'm sure you all know what happened in Krugersdorp on Friday. Any of you spend as much time on Twitter as I do, and working on it, you will know just how scary the vitriol is against Africans on Twitter. And it's gone now, it's not Nigerians, people can think are very foreign. It's Basotho, people next door, who share ethnicity, language, history, culture with a significant part of South Africa's population. There is no way that you can have a national interest that is about African solidarity when South African people hate Africans. I think a big part of addressing the unemployment situation that we have and very high levels of poverty is bringing on board the private sector. And I found it interesting that I think there's a paragraph about the private sector in the national interest document, and it made me think of the late ambassador Dumsani Khumalo, who used to say that South Africa's biggest diplomatic corps are all the businessmen walking around the continent. The diplomatic representation of South Africa is ShopRite and Northern Mining companies. What is their role? How do we bring them in? Rushing along to the political risks to national interest. For me, this is political and administrative risks to national interest. First one I'd like to highlight is our weak public service. Public servants that don't do their jobs. And we see that manifested at municipal level, at provincial level, at national level. And where we have people working for the South African state who are not working in the national interest of the South African state. We've seen in the past few months what has come out of the Home Affairs Department about Home Affairs officials that sell IDs and passports. We've seen what's come out around our very poor education levels at basic education, teachers who aren't in class. The patriotism, the sense of national interest amongst the people that work in the South African state, I think, is something that poses a threat, or the lack of patriotism, the sense of national interest is something that poses a threat to the national interest as a whole and the implementation of the very admirable ideals in this document. It would be remiss of me not to mention, having given the way I spent my weekend, the political infighting with the governing party, but also manifestations that we are seeing of fighting between different political parties and different political interests, and the insecurity that that is causing at all levels of South African society. And what we are seeing emerging politically, and similar, I think, to what we are seeing in many countries across the world, is the re-emergence of right-wing ideology and rhetoric, and its growing political currency. So the political parties that are growing most rapidly in South Africa are those that espouse ideals that contradict the ideals set out in our constitution and in our constitutional order. In the current MNC of the city of Johannesburg lost a court case last week about removing vendors and informal traders from the CBD, the number of people then that went onto social media saying that this constitution is the problem. We've given people too many rights in this constitution. And it is not improbable that South Africans will elect a government in the next 12 years that will have a big enough majority, or be able to amass a big enough majority to reverse fundamental parts of our Bill of Rights and other parts of our much loved and much lauded Constitution. And we will have chosen it. South Africans are likely, are on the way to electing a government that will reverse the 1996 Constitution, democratically. And I think that is something of serious concern. Third is the environmental risks. I know that there's a lot of discussion at the moment around extreme weather and the impacts of climate change. I think one of the major risks to the sustainability of South Africa is sovereignty.
Make 5 points. Okay, maybe make 1 point and 4 conclusions. So whichever direction it is. But the first one is about shifts. It's very important that this discussion was delayed. I know that a lot of people are talking about this national interest work that needs to come out, because people think that it is no longer sufficient to say everybody generally knows what South Africa stands for, that perhaps to codify it. Perhaps delaying it allows us to be wiser in doing it than we would have now. So that shift in time is actually an advantage for us to harness. We now know what works and what doesn't work. Then start. The second one to make about the shift is this. There are 3 areas of shifts that I think we need to be alert to, and I know we know it. One is the one we like focusing on, which is the pillaring of the international order. The pillars of the pillaring of the international order. That pillaring has been shifting all the time, and there is likelihood that it's going to shift going forward as well. From unipolar to bipolar to multipolar to unimultipolar, as we said in the mid-20s, in the 2000s, to bipolar with the rise of China, to bi-multi, which is the 2 plus the rest, bi-multi, and we don't know which direction this is going to go. Because increasingly the Union is no longer a single country. The Union is a collection of countries, as you see with the question of Ukraine. When you say the Union, you don't mean one country dominating, but you mean a coalition of countries that identify as one, dominant, and all of that. So, where this is going, we have to think about it, because there's an implication for all our national actions and our international relations. The second one, when we talk about shift, we talk about hierarchical order. The hierarchical order around which the world is organized has a long history. Going back to the Roman Empire, some issue was doing that, but firmed up in the last 500 years. Excuse me, after Columbus got lost and landed in what became Americas, and it was not so called, it was not said it got lost, it was said discovered. And from that point, a new order emerges, and that is hierarchical. That is because we've all come to accept this idea, which is not the only truth, that power is organized hierarchically, and therefore the duty for everyone is to acquire it, accumulate it. And inevitably, it means when you accumulate, you rob someone of it. It's by nature, you rob someone of it. So it happens at every level, global level, continental level, regional level. The notion of power is hierarchical, where you've come to accept, which is not old. It's only about 500 years old, part of the Euro-modernity idea. It's perhaps part of the challenge we are facing that leads to permanent contestation over this power. Permanent, even within the group who are at the center. Permanent contestation about this accumulation of power and wealth. The third one about this shift is shifts in attitudes. Certainly the shift in attitude at every level, shift in attitude about all manner of things, about how who must dominate, who must not dominate, shift in attitude about what we should do, the attitude about solidarity, and all of this kind of things. Even if we use the word solidarity, they shift attitude about what it is. And this shift in attitude, the problem with it is that they are not moving in any direction firmly, but they are moving in every direction, and that confuses us because we are better able to handle a trend that moves in one direction. But at global level, this direction is various direction. One direction moves for a moment, and then there is a massive change and all of that. I don't want to elaborate that. The second point I wanted to make is with regard to global power balances. That given what I've said, they present huge limitations for what we are able to do. And that is why idealism is very important for us, because it buys us time between the time when it is not ideal for us to do what we say we do and the time when it actually happens. Take a very practical example of Latin America. Latin America tends to shift to the left and to the right all the time. Now, idealism enables us to keep the idea, keep the vision, keep the plan for the time, for the dark time, the valley of the shadow of development and the light wind, because light wind time will end. It swings every 5, 6, 7 years. So idealism helps us to pick up those opportunities when it happens. And I think when we hosted the Global Conference Against Racism in 2000, it was a precious opportunity for us to do what we've been waiting for 30 years. After the World Peace Conference that took place in what was Yugoslavia at the time, and had made this point a very big point. And we wait for 30 years for an opportune time to happen in 2002 in Durban. And it happens that way. We keep the idea going for a precious opportunity to happen. I think the idea of solidarity as a key mechanism of conducting international relations was helped by the presence of COVID-19, which made it not debatable that shared challenges require us to pull resources well. But whether we harness that and keep it and maintain it and lock it into the system so that we don't have to vessel is another question. Related to that, it's not just the global imbalance that's the problem, but it is instrumentalization of it, weaponization of it. The imbalance of power is an outcome of how everything is structured, especially after the Second World War. But the instrumentalization of it by creating exclusive coalitions that must impose an idea about how we should respond to the question of Russia and Ukraine, or of trips and the provision of accessible medicine to those who cannot. And the creation of these coalitions that are exclusive, that us against them, us rather, is instrumentalization. Militarization, unilateral action is another one. The third point I wanted to make is that the global commons therefore has been a huge platform for us to advance our agenda. And I would say us, I mean those on the margins of this hierarchical global order. You may be in Fiji, or you may be in Haiti, or you may be in Uzbekistan. We share this thing of on the margins of the system, and we share this kind of hope that the global commons are a platform where we find the convergence of our national interests, and that they enable us to have international or joint international action. And therefore our greatest challenge would be, now that we have spelled out our interests, which we already know, how do we keep harnessing that convergence of national interests around global commons? What are these global commons that we share with the largest number of countries in the world that we can then use to make advances, where they may be differences in culture and history and other things, but we definitely agree that there must be reduction of poverty. Or we definitely agree that injustice anywhere is unacceptable. Or we definitely agree that war can never solve any problem, but peace is a superiority. What is global commons around which we can find a convergence of interest, even if we instrumentalize it ourselves? The fourth point, speak of everything, the fourth point is the ideological. The ideological, dear colleagues, it remains very important. Nationalism, Trump really represented very well, which is to be international while by refusing to be international. To be international by just moving everything, making international national. I can explain that. But progressive internationalism has been associated, going back again to the World Peace Conference of in Yugoslavia, with belief in the international law, belief in institutions of global governance, while reforming a multi-level approach to internationalism. But Minister, our pronouncing on this suggests that we will not be statist. And it's very difficult for governments not to be statist. It would mean that if we need to handle the issues in the DRC, we will take our court along. Because there are certain things government can't say and do, but our court can say and do. It means that when we have to handle the issues of international digital migration, we will take MTN along. Not reluctantly, but enthusiastically, because they are part of the national. But the national is not governmental. But there are implications we need to think about when we put out those ideas. Pan-Africanism is also another one that has implications. Some of them pointed out by my sister who is telling. Part of it is the fact that Africa is a contested thing. Africa is not a one thing. It's a contested space. Not entirely ours either. It's dominated by non-Africans too. There are some non-Africans that have a more influence on African developments than we, who are Africans, do. We must be very realistic about it. And then the neo-colonial designs are very important. Africa is a fragmented space. It was by design that it was so. Berlin was not an insignificant. I must recall the chaos of Berlin remains with us in very deep ways that we hardly ever realize. We crack at points when we need to coalesce. Self-hate is a very important part of it, colleagues, you must all know. Part of the reason why we always talk about South Korea being at the same point as a number of countries in Ghana and others in 1961. But South Korea moves up rather like this, and Ghana doesn't move there. Part of it are non-material elements of life. What do we mean? Amita Cabral calls it the dissonance, the social dissonance of the society, which is deeper than fragmentation, bigger than division. Something really deep in the soul of a country was interfered with, and you are hoping to grow as fast as those that did not have that. And lastly, our mass rush to saying that, but all of this has to, all this effort we want to do has to be mindful, has to come up against our ability to ensure that our ideas are understood, not just by governments across the world, but by peoples across the world. South Africa's greatest advantage, I remember with COP17, was the fact that for once we had a government in the negotiations that had views that were similar to those who were protesting outside the organization. Sometimes we forget to do that we have a shared view with critical civil society. So when we outnumber those who are in the room, because we have exactly the same views with those who are outside. At the time, it was the idea of common but differentiated responsibility. That idea, we were pushing it internally, but it was actually an idea of the World Social Forum, where we Untitled, of the World Labour Forum, and of the anti-globalization movement, and all of those stuff. We shared that in. But our ability to realize that they are also with us and harness and all that is something we need to think about. On many issues, even on the TRIPS issue about vaccines, the COVID vaccine, it's a view shared by global civil society. The Southern African Civil Society Forum said the same thing. The ECOSOC of the AU, when met last year online, it said the same thing that we were pushing. So we have a view that is popular, but we quite realize that it is popular. And lastly, and that popular, element of that popular is the youth. But we cannot speak for youth without the youth. We cannot speak for youth without the youth. So we have to remember they are the majority, and they are also the future. They are the ones who are going to live with the consequences of us achieving or not achieving Agenda 2063. They will be there. We want them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Sonki. You were efficient with time. You saved us 3 minutes. Thank you.
Okay.
We now move on to Mr. Singh on development, on the development of South Africa's national interest and foreign policy.
Thank you, Ambassador. Minister Pendle, Deputy Minister of Forces, Program Director, Chairperson, Ambassador Piseko, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It really is a privilege for me to address such an esteemed panel of speakers and such an esteemed audience this morning. Chairperson, the task I've been given is to provide a brief reflection on the development of South Africa's national interest in foreign policy. I must admit, though, that when I first saw this topic, my immediate reaction was that I would be singing to the choir here, because, given the audience that we have. And accordingly, I thought it would be best to structure my thoughts along just 3 key points for consideration in the discussion that will follow. So firstly, and in addition to the keynote address on recent developments relating to the framework documents, I will touch briefly on how South Africa's national interest has been historically defined and developed. And secondly, how has this contributed to the substance and the trajectory of South African foreign policy priorities? And lastly, building on Sithile's earlier remarks, what are some of the key opportunities for us to capitalize and the challenges we must confront and arrest in order to optimally pursue our national interest within the international system moving forward? And I am aware of time, so I will keep my remarks quite short. I should add that my remarks are, of course, primarily based on our experiences at the Institute for Security Studies and working closely with the South African government, the South African foreign policy establishment over many years, and specifically in responding to the various human security challenges confronting South Africa and the African continent in general. Excellencies, to begin with, I think it's important for us to focus our attention on the primary sources in which South Africa's national interest has taken shape over the years. While the Constitution is, of course, the guiding light which affirms the core values and principles that direct South Africa's engagements on the world stage, there are, of course, a number of documents, official documents, that specifically speak to the long-term foreign policy priorities of South Africa. And of course, importantly, which are viewed in isolation from the more pragmatic, short-term foreign policy priorities of specific individual political administrations. So all of these documents in some way help us to aggregate domestic interests and broad public interests, such that these can specifically direct and inform South African foreign policy. I think the most commonly referred to documents to this effect include, for example, the 2011 Foreign Policy White Paper, the National Development Plan, the 2019 Foreign Service Act, and the National Security Strategy, amongst just a few. So these documents bring to the fore defining issues which must effectively inform and drive how the country should pursue its interests on the world stage. These include, for example, the centrality of South Africa's commitments and capability toward promoting democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and peace and security. The necessity for our foreign policy to be people-centered and guided by notions of solidarity and social and economic justice. The understanding that South Africa's own development, peace, and prosperity is intricately intertwined with that of the Southern African region and the continent more broadly. And accordingly, the importance of placing Africa at the center of our international relations. There's also the acute acknowledgement that power imbalances across the international system and necessitates the need to forge and champion South-South solidarity, as well as to reform the international governance system. And additionally, these documents make clear that the pursuit of our interests on the world stage must be informed and seek to address the various issues that define our domestic agenda, particularly as these relate to addressing poverty, unemployment, and inequality, as the Minister earlier mentioned. Beyond these documents, we also see national interests take shape within, for example, the 96 White Paper in National Defense for the Republic of South Africa, the 99 White Paper on South Africa's participation in international peace missions, and also in 1999 and 2015 defense reviews, amongst a number of other official government papers. So when read together, these documents speak to a more traditional understanding of the fundamental purpose of foreign policy and what South Africa should aim to pursue in its various bilateral and multilateral engagements. And these are made with respect to, of course, safeguarding the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the country and the well-being of its citizens, aligning and rationalizing our defense forces for the good of the region and the continent, and orienting our civilian, military, and police contributions to international peace and security efforts in a way that best responds to our commitment towards the promotion of human rights, democracy, justice, and international law, the collective interests of Africa in world affairs, and the protection of South Africa's constitutional order. It should also be noted here that for the most part, these various documents followed from extensive draft consultative processes with inputs from a wide array of different government stakeholders and civil society actors. And consequently, the refinement over time of the national interest has indeed been fairly transparent and democratic, and often characterized by robust debate and oftentimes disagreements over how our broad constitutional values and principles may be interpreted and utilized in order to direct and inform South African foreign policy priorities. More importantly, these interests have been fairly consistently expressed in our foreign policy throughout different periods, marked by different South African political administrations since 1994. From the early idealism of the Mandela era to a more aspirational and pronounced search for regional leadership under Mbeki, to a more pragmatic turn and emphasis on South-South cooperation, and to the current focus on renewal and clawing back lost gains on the world stage. While we will, of course, all disagree with this kind of simplistic characterization, I think we can all agree on the fact that South Africa's expressed commitments on the world stage, its expressed obligations within multilateral institutions, and our expressed priorities in our regional and continental engagements have indeed been consistent and reflective of the national interest by the various historical documents I just mentioned. The development of a national framework document is of course therefore welcome, as it assists us in finally providing a single key resource upon which we are able to understand, assess, and monitor how South Africa's international engagements are responding to these interests, and whether our foreign policy is in fact rationalized, operating according to the key values and principles enshrined in the Constitution and informed by years of consultation, public input, and evidence-based research analysis and policy making. So Chairperson, Excellencies, the development of this framework is undoubtedly a positive development and should be commended. However, and this is the inevitable however that we must all confront, and building on Sitting Elet's earlier remarks, there are major challenges standing in the way of South Africa pursuing and realizing its national interest on the world stage. Remaining cognizant of the time I've been provided, I won't go into too much detail here, as many of the points have been covered, but I think it's worth pointing out that the challenges faced by South African foreign policy actors can primarily be attributed to the disjuncture, or should I say more importantly, a perceived disjuncture between what is said and what is ultimately done in pursuit of the national interest. While the expression of our national interest on the world stage has remained fairly consistent, tangible actions, initiatives, interventions to illustrate and concretize South Africa's commitment to, for example, human rights, democracy, rule of law, and international peace and security have often sometimes fallen short of expectation. And this is, of course, by no means a challenge faced uniquely by South Africa, but by Durban's own admission in the 2018 Foreign Policy Review, these unmet expectations have clearly eroded the once significant reserves of political and moral capital that the country once was able to build, allowing South Africa to more effectively punch above its weight in the international system and to consequently pursue its national interests more freely. South Africa's clear commitment to the peace, security, and stability of the African continent, for example, is unambiguous. It's clearly illustrated through recent high-level multilateral engagements on the United Nations and the African Union and the South African Development Community, amongst a number of other organizations. However, the country's bilateral interventions in support of these multilateral positions have not necessarily reflected the central place that Africa occupies in our international relations, or the extent to which the continent's peace, security, and development is tied to our own. So the perceptions of this structure are also made all the more stark given the priority that South Africa once afforded its African agenda, in which South Africa played an outsized role in taking the lead and effectively underwriting the costs of vital regional and continental institutions, championing the creation of new institutions and policy frameworks, actively working toward mediation and peacemaking roles across the continent's conflict hotspots, and providing considerable technical and operational contributions to multilateral peacekeeping and peace-building efforts. Again, Chairperson and Excellencies, this is not to say that South Africa no longer does any of this, but rather that we are no longer playing this role to the extent that we once did, and that we are not adequately exploiting the full spectrum of tools and capabilities that we have at our disposal to pursue our national interest in a more directed, influential, and strategic manner. And I say this very in mind, for example, the drawn-out transition of the African Renaissance and International Cooperation Fund to the South African Development Partnership Agency, which should be one of the most vital tools to pursue bilateral programmatic efforts in support of conflict resolution, peace building, and democratic consolidation across the continent. I also say this bearing in mind the international relations desks within a number of metropolitan and municipal local governments, which often do not coordinate their strategic engagements with international stakeholders in a coordinated, coherent manner with national government officials. And I also say this bearing in mind the wealth of expertise and experience found among South African civil society, think tanks, academia, and grassroots level organizations, which could be called upon and leveraged by governments in undertaking these kinds of strategic bilateral interventions across the region. As I come to an end, just one final, another significant issue in the development and pursuit of the national interest relates, of course, to the increasingly turbulent and volatile international system, requiring ever more responsive foreign policy decision-making on increasingly polarizing issues as they emerge, as well as requiring ever more adept capacity for public diplomacy. while state-to-state diplomacy may often be conducted on the features and merits of individual cases, an increasingly uncertain future may require states like South Africa to develop a more systematic framework for detailing how to engage with categories of states. This could be based on clear objective criteria relating to, for example, whether or not the states are democratic, inclusive, and whether or not they mirror our own constitutional values. Chairperson, Excellencies, thank you once again for this opportunity to engage with you. In the interest of time, I will conclude my remarks here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Singh. You were dead on time. And now over to Prof. Mleka.
Thank you, Ambassador. Good morning, everybody. I will tell myself, Madam Ambassador, thank you for the invitation. I was somewhat surprised by the invitation. IR specialists are a tricky bunch, so I didn't think they would invite someone who focuses on history and domestic affairs, but I'm delighted nonetheless to be here. Mine is a call to reimagine ourselves as a nation, to revisit our national identity in order to counter the immediate challenges that are posed by the region and the continent. I've been given a topic, I addressed that topic, but I can't promise that I address it in its entirety or exclusively. But there's this key point, as I say, of consideration for reimagination that I want to put across. The key question really I'm asked to ponder here is how do we interact with the rest of the world in a manner that doesn't compromise but advances our national interests. And these national interests domestically are quite clear, and they are spelled out eloquently in the document: economic, security, and all those. So one need not go into detail there, but I will touch on them as I go along. But these interests also extend to the region. And these regional interests may not be obvious, but they are equally important. Because whatever happens in the region impacts on our ability to achieve our own objectives here. So in a way, there is a necessity to, as we pursue our domestic interests, somewhat put equal effort to addressing problems that surround us in this country. For instance, economies in the region, our neighbors around us, are not doing well. And inevitably, as any other human being anywhere in the world, as it has happened in history, they will continue looking for places where they are likely to find prosperity. Our urgent problem that we are seized with, which is a popular outcry, is the influx of immigrants, both legal and illegal. We cry, we complain about this issue, we protest that it is an issue that we can protest away, but it is an issue that will remain with us so long as the economies around us are not in a sustainable or stable condition. So it's a problem that will remain with us, and the question becomes, what do we do with that? Hence my point about the interconnectedness of our domestic and regional issues, because these are closest and immediate and with a direct impact on us. Secondly, what we are as South Africans, or become as we grapple with this issue, has a demonstrative effect on the rest of the continent. The vibrancy of our constitution, or rather democracy, and the prosperity of our country becomes illustrative of the viability of democracy, an experiment that has not been unanimously accepted on the continent. Today, Rwanda is turning itself into a penal center for Britain. Rwanda dictatorial government is becoming somewhat fashionable, pointed at as a model of development. There was a time when the rest of the world was calling for democracy because it recognized the universal value of democracy, equality. And now, with Rwanda's development and other parts of the continent not doing so well, everyone is asking, why not follow Rwanda? And the attractiveness of this country is because of economic development. So democracies are somewhat challenged, are questioned, especially in relation to their ability to deliver. Here in this country, we often heard that perhaps we have too much democracy. We talk a lot. We need to cut down consultations, have someone strong, and they point us to one. So the success of our democracy is important to underscore that democracy can also deliver. You need not undercut or undermine human rights to achieve a better life. But of course, we do face serious challenges in this country. As I said earlier, illegal immigrants, particularly, are flowing into the country in large numbers. People complain that they're taking their jobs. Alongside this seems to be uncertainty within official on our immigration regime. What do we do with this? Do we allow? Do we? Now and then you get to hear foreign spokesperson for this department on TV, radio saying, no, we do allow foreigners to come in provided they have skills. Foreigners complain, or applicants complain that we have applied, we have waited for so many. Rhetorically, there is a declaration of openness to foreign nationals, especially those with skills. But in terms of the infrastructure, the openness of our country, it's not there. We are uncertain, should we allow them in or not? And this uncertainty is not unexpected, because we are a sovereign country, a country born out of nationalism, a country problem is a definitional problem. It's an identity problem that we need to grapple with. We need to grapple with this problem mainly because it is imposing itself on us, whether we like it or not. We will continue to have foreign nationals coming in. And they come in, whether we like it or not, they sneak in and they demand. Just this past Christmas, there were more kids born to foreign nationals than there were to locals in some of these hospitals. That's the extent to which they are demanding, they are stating their claim on the national resources. And so, we need to recognize as well that we are not the only country to deal with this problem, this immigration problem. Europe has had to contend with this for a while now, for a number of reasons. Poor economies in Eastern Europe, for instance, instability, the Balkan states and all that, has led to exodus of folks in those countries into Europe, Western Europe particularly. Poor economies also in Eastern Europe. These people forced themselves into Britain, France, and added to that were needs within internally, aging population, the desire for skills that were absent in those countries. So big was this problem, especially in France. France has they've had to initiate a debate on what it is to be French, because we have all sorts of people from all over the world flocking into France. There were, of course, nationalist extremists who were not happy with this, but nonetheless it was something that was happening. And it became so prominent in the public space, in the country, there were issues about French identity, whether it was okay for Muslim kids to wear attire that covered their faces and hands, and this is not what it means to be French, they said. And the point is that France needed some of these skills, and these people were forcing themselves into the country. I'm not sure how this debate has been settled, but it is quite clear sitting in this part of the world that France is no longer white. A lot of Muslims, most African folks, different religions. That country is changing. Their soccer, their culture is changing. And I think in some corners they've admitted that they've somewhat become an immigrant nation of sorts. An immigrant nation forced by circumstances. So these debates come, all countries to get themselves at a particular point in history, and that their identity they assume at a certain point sticks because that's what the country is at the time. But the world changes, factors emerge, dynamics within countries emerge, and countries have to now grapple, who are we? I think we are a who are. Unfortunately for us, this is the second question about who are we, because we grapple with this united in diversity. Still was talking about the right wing in South Africa who are, deceiving us into believing that they're a civil rights movement when they are really a racist organization. So we've been forced to reconcile with these racist folks. And on the other hand, we have foreign nationals coming in, and locals are now complaining that these people, it's a double whammy, right? Parallel problems that we have to deal with. But it is something that we have to grapple with. Follow examples of other countries everywhere. Especially in Europe. So it goes without saying here that we need to learn from those debates. Because to me, once we have made peace with who we are, but most importantly, with who we are becoming, right? We're becoming. We can't define ourselves purely based on the past. So once we make peace with that we may perhaps have to call ourselves to something akin to an immigrant nation, or more acceptable definition would be a Pan-African nation. Because we are changing as a society, and will continue to change in the same way that Europe has been changing lately. And there are benefits to these. Once we make this change, policy regime would follow suit, because there would have been some kind of consensus conceptually that everything else should follow from there. And the benefits, obviously, of opening up, especially to skilled folks from, especially the continent. My main interest is the continent and the Africans in the diaspora. A lot of Africans out there who are looking to come home to the continent or close to home, and South Africa presents them with it's a very attractive destination. But the uncertainty in how we deal with this thing closes us to that possibility. So my final point there, as I close, Madam Ambassador, final point is that, and this is the main point, we have these problems that we are faced with. And the problems are not of our own doing. Influx of immigrants. And they will continue to come. We might do all sorts of things. America has been dealing with the same issue. Europe has been dealing with that. So we can't sit back and say, continue chasing them away. What because of demand? Because they're being pushed by, logically, it's common sense, they're being pushed by factors in their own countries. And like any other human being in the world with a basic instinct of self-preservation, they go looking for where life is better. And this is closest better life. So they'll come. So then how do you adapt to that? This is a challenge, but a challenge with potential benefits that we can do. All we need to do is identify ourselves to meet that challenge. Thank you.
you very much, Professor Mlejana, for that inspiring input that leads us into the discussion. I will not even begin to summarize these very rich discussions, but the way in which Professor Mlejana ends, I think for me, brings us back to the purpose of this exercise. Who are we? Who are we when I say I am South African and I am a South African diplomat? Who exactly am I? How do I define that? And this has been a very rich discussion. It's touched on a variety of areas. I haven't acknowledged our media that is here. I see Karen is here as a vital component of this discussion that we was trying to explain to her, related to the question that the point Professor Mlejana makes about South Africa cannot fail as an endeavor because of the richness of it, what we bring to the table. And a critical part of that is the media that is free. And in a way, I think it's not always clear to our media that actually people wake up and look at News 24 actually African diplomats to see what is happening, because there's like a base currency that comes with it that nobody has instructed you to write. Nobody wishes for a particular outcome in what you everything. So how do we factor the role of the media? But on the other hand, do you and I recognize each other? I mean, are we saying the same thing when we say we're South African? It's these questions that we need to ask. And I like this project excited me because I think it must also generate a discussion about national identity, national coherence, whereas we weave in the youth and everybody and all of it. So, Minister, I'd like to suggest that this perhaps is maybe the beginning of a very interesting dialogue that must be broadened and followed up by others. Professor Mr. Singh, the point you made about, the level of which we've invested in the ideals in the continent is well worth discussing further, especially with respect to post-conflict reconstruction and development. That is really, really, really important. Professor Zondi, you talk about the continent as a contested continent, but also a continent that is not homogeneous, but has its own historical challenges. It is the most precious currency of the continent that is under contestation, its unity. The incredible amount of money is invested in undermining the unity of the continent, because there's 54 of us, a substantial number within the UN system. The amount of money that is spent on encroaching on the collective policy space of the Africans. We are going to help Africa establish a common position. We're going to help Africa do this and do that. Money was spent to prime Africa to commit in a particular way to the Paris Agreement, on the basis of preconceived obligations that others thought Africa must take on. Under pressure, Africa took those. A month later, Africa was saying, sorry, we cannot bear these responsibilities. But the amount of money that had been invested going to individual countries, how does our media work with that? And I'm seeing also articles that are coming up that are unearthing these pressures that are being put on the continent. And I encourage those, because it means we're all together in the trenches, trying to defend whichever way we can continental interests. Dr. Zondi, for me, the likelihood of a government that will reverse everything that we have accomplished is probably what drives officials at it must not happen. But domestically, on the domestic front, implementation, you talk about the weak civil service. We don't, I would argue, have a civil service. We have a loose connection. They're distinct from civil services of developmental states that doesn't run together, but whose primary business is to outsource functions of the state. Therefore, we cannot outsource its function, it has to do things. So therefore, it's distinct in that, in being what you would call a proper civil service that does deliver. They have to negotiate agreements, they have to show up at negotiations. They do not hire a consultant, but the day-to-day business. And this is of the scope of the civil services to outsource services. Clearly, the model needs to be addressed by academics. Is this the ideal model? We are locked into it. Does it serve South Africa? With that, I will open the floor to discussion and then come and give the minister, hand over to the minister to respond, and then dear voters will close this session. I see hands up already. I can't see, it's dark there. Please, there's a hand there, it's a flag up.
Yes.
Please talk.
Thank you very much.
Can you introduce yourselves, please?
Thank you, Ambassador. My name is Pilani Tembu from the Institute for Global Dialogue. Mine is a two-pronged question, but prior to that, a quick response with a question to the regional nature of our nationhood and what impact that has on policy and the conceptualization of the national interest. Is South Africa a regional state or a traditional Westphalian nation state? And what impact does that have on our responsibility, both domestically, but also in the region? Now, to the question, it relates to the specificity of foreign policy and its practice. Whilst the current government's view of the world is underpinned by progressive internationalism, others may share other views. So, for example, the Democratic Alliance may be more inclined towards liberal internationalism. What impact does that have in terms of the task of building consensus on the specificity of particular foreign policy issues? How would different political parties, for instance, tackle Palestine, Western Sahara, the African Command? Is there a hypothetical scenario where, for instance, a different government is in power in South Africa and takes a different stance towards Ukraine, takes a different stance towards the US putting its embassy in South Africa? Or not its embassy, but its military structures. Now, to that, what processes can be put in place to build consensus on the various contentious matters related to international relations amongst the various political parties, spheres of government, and non-state actors? Last point, Ambassador, is on the exercise of power. When the country's national interests are threatened through the actions of external actors, what tools are we willing and able to utilize? Political, economic, social, military. And how can we strengthen those tools and capabilities while building consensus on their use within the country? Thank you.
Thank you. I will try to be balanced. I will take a question from this side and then come back to the other side. The middle doesn't seem to be a middle at all. So I'll start with Ambassador Mzako. I saw you hand up.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Seko, Minister, Deputy Minister, and panel. One thing that I thought we needed to do also, you know, I was fascinated by an interview that Halima Motlanthe did, and we were asking a question: why is it that South Africa is taking this position on Ukraine? And his answer was, the national anthem, the Sotho version, which was written in 1942, in the middle of the war, is the one that pronounces our thinking in terms of war, peace, and prosperity. That's why it says, Morena Morgas Chawazayetu, Felicity Nodemachonya. It's there, it's deep in our history. We sing it in our national anthem. It's about us, and it tells us our attitude. And if you look at the history and the position that South Africa took on that one, and what the minister also referred to, on the African claims, we can answer the question that Ilan has just raised. African claims together, taken together with the Freedom Charter. The last clause of the Freedom Charter, there shall be peace and security. It spells out very clearly our attitude towards the region. So when we talk about the region as our main basis of our foreign policy, and you look at the dynamics of what South Africa is and this region, it's not just posturally, but it's steeped in reality and history. And it informs who we are. And even the questions of solidarity that the minister has talked about. You know, you go back in our history. I remember I was doing Standard 4 in 1960. I does not say anything about my age anyway. But one of the songs that we used to sing, I remember going to the zoo, you know, in buses, was Shebeleza Kongo. Shebeleza Kongo. Because in the township there was that enthusiasm about the independence of the Congo. And that's where that song derives from. And we used to sing it as kids, Shebeleza Kongo. Even the one about take over your country in the castaway. The solidarity of Cuba doesn't start now. We welcome the victory, the Cuban Revolution at that time. I know it as a kid because that song was very sad. So I'm saying that this progressive internationalism, steeped in our own interest, domestic interest, and reflection of that, is written all over in our history. Because particularly Africa, what is it all about? Time is upon the line. Africa might be Africa. That's what was it all about? So when we talk about the African agenda, it's not just a theory or anything. And our own socialization, at least my generation, we grew up with that understanding. Because when we begin to interrogate these things at the stage, Africa might be Africa. What does that mean? The regeneration of Africa was 50%. So I'm saying that when we talk about the national interest in our foreign policy, you can see it all over in our history, written in song and poem. The poem about humanity, the sinking of humanity, the song around it, it tells you something about how we're expressing ourselves, all our involvement in that way, in the thinking of humanity. So I think we have to go back even in our curriculum, in our schools. Keep on these things because they define who we are. And today, when we say anything, we're being inspired by that particular history which is right. And when we express our national interest, even our national security strategy, which is informed by national interest, It defines exactly who we are. Because if we don't understand who we are as South Africans, you know, you look at our national anthem, you can look at any angle of it, any language, and you try to take something out of it and link it to the whole question of the national interest. In its various ways and different diversity and historical experiences. But the commonality that comes out of that, in the end, defines who we are. And I think we should not be shy about those things. Because at the end of the day, the space, the positions that we take in our foreign policy positions, or any other policy that we move on. And I think for me, that history given my generation and what I've learned, and when I reflect on it, because I've never been subjected to any educational system except one education. I started with it in 1954, so I know it up to university. There's nothing else I know about education. So I'm not saying it was good, but we're good teachers. And that's where our political consciousness derives from. Thank you. I just wanted to, bring in that element that sometimes, the certain things that we don't take into consideration. It becomes a normal way of us being us. When we talk about Banyana, we're not talking about anything. It's us, it's our parents.
Thank you, Ambassador. I allowed you to go on a bit again because this brings us back to this common identity. The branch global vision and mission that says, bound together by a common patriotism. This is what we will strive to achieve. From what you're saying, Minister, I'm sensing a suggestion that maybe this document also is made accessible to schools to we find a way of engaging with the youth and the schools and the teachers. I will come back to my left. As I said, please look at me, I can't see you exactly. It's a light jacket here. Then look here. Yeah.
Gentleman right
At the back, in a cream
white shirt in front of him, and the lady here. So if you take those three,
and then we
then
come
you
this
can
side.
take three this side, that helps a little bit.
Okay.
But you are still cheering, I was just
Thank you, ladies.
Almost witnessed a coach. No, thanks. I am Skumbuzo Tomu. I come from the International Relations of the African National Congress. That was my invite, Chairperson, Comrade Ambassador. Now that we are here with the NI, what implications does it have in its byproducts, i.e. our security interests and the economic interests that we have done? I know we negotiated 8 years the IPA. A trade agreement takes a very long time, Chairperson. Europe just sanctioned Russia, and we are in this agreement with them. What impact does that have? I'm trying to be nifty to bring this to current realities. I mean, Minister Pando leads a delegation to country X tomorrow. And then she solves the conflict. And then what must happen is we must now send South African companies to rebuild the country. It's an economic interest issue. What nifty footwork must be in place to allow her to do that, to supplement, because we cannot just only send soldiers out there. I'm talking to the security aspects that both Naidu and Comrade Oyinde were raising earlier. Now, if this document allows us the niftiness, because some of the things are going to have to be decisions on the spot. It's not going to be possible for her to come back, go to Parliament, and then there's a debate, while an agreement can even collapse. I've seen it. When the situation was in Eritrea, Congo, MI6, it happens. We go out there, we sort out conflicts. But when we must come in with the economic support, the discussion is never ending. Even those companies, how do we select them? Who goes where, how? Do we have a database? I think this helps us, Chair, in the issue of economic interests on that front. And then the last one, because of time, Chair, I don't know, Russians and Chinese are talking to Iran and Venezuela. If tomorrow they wake up and they say, look, we don't think BRICS is working for us, what's our position on this? And I'm saying this because Pelosi might be in Taiwan tomorrow, and we have the one China policy. And we don't seem to be buying Russian products which are cheaper than OPEC. Why must they be in partnership with us? I mean, if they decide tomorrow they wake up and say, look here, why must we be in partnership with South Africa? And Venezuela shares the same pain, Iran. I'm trying to say, Comrade C, the shift is there, is imminent, and wars accelerate shifts. We need to come up with something. Yes, the wars must stop, but how do we balance? I mean, Comrade Tambo, Comrade Bedino was able to speak to both the West and the East. Are we still in the same position as SA? To speak to both Biden and Putin? And they must understand that our outreach, global outreach, is of the world's interest. World interest, and then our national interest. So, if I had time, I would explain all these things, Chair, but those are just a few quick ones to say that there's an imminent thing, and this war, or whatever it is in Ukraine, has set off the world on a dangerous path, and we need to find ways to it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Comrade Kumbuso Eto. You raised a question on a subject that warrants time aside on its own. Yes, a symposium on its own, but we will bear that in mind. And I've got somebody here in front, and then we have the lady.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm Gustavo de Carvalho from the South African Institute of International Affairs and the University of Johannesburg. Thank you, first of all, for the ministry to bring us all together. And I think that in itself is an important process. Because the challenge sometimes of developing public policies and developing instruments that are supposed to, and I like what Ambassador said, of understanding who we are, is that those ideas need to be socialized. These ideas need to be engaged. And we shouldn't see this as a once-off event. Because the problem we find with many of these processes at times is that we create another policy, we understand that there is there, but it's not necessarily something that is utilized and referred not only by the ministry, but also the broader community that engages with foreign policy on a daily basis. And I think from a civil society point of view, it's quite important that we, and this is probably one of the first rules around confidence building and conflict resolution, that we don't need to agree with one another, but we do need to understand each other. Because otherwise there is no conversation that is being held here. And I do think documents like this can be quite helpful for us to understand, to analyze, and to provide the open supports that we want as civil society to strengthen South Africa's role in the world and in Africa. But there's a few questions in here, is that how do we avoid that being a once-off event? How do we avoid that this document has now been endorsed, has been approved, has been presented and discussed in a forum like this, but it's also constantly part of the discussions the government provides within its own bilateral, multilateral engagements, but also from all of us, from civil society, academia, think tanks, and so on, are also able to reflect on that and identify where things went well, where are some of the inconsistencies, And in a way, I think it brings to the question, and just to summarize, if we know who we are, as Ambassador mentioned, do we know what we want, but how do we do that? And I think that is often what a lot of the speakers mention about. Because at the end of the day, we may have all of those interests, but there is limited resources, capacity, all of those risks that were mentioned that require a degree of prioritization. Of course, in identifying those big interests, there was already a process of prioritization, but on a daily basis, which ones comes higher, especially in this space which many countries face similar situations like South Africa, where you have this tension between domestic interests and international interests. Because for societies, often the challenge is, well, foreign policy is something that is far away. It shouldn't be that major priority. We have enough problems internally to deal with. And I think part of the risk with that is that we start showing foreign policy as a unilateral process. That it's South Africa going to the outside, not the outside also coming to South Africa. And overcoming this potential tension, and the questions that often arise, why is South Africa deploying troops to the DRC when we have all of the challenges internally? There are several reasons why we are there, and there are several reasons why it makes sense for a country like South Africa to be there. But it's important that those lessons that comes from our deployment in the DRC or mediation process throughout the continent actually come back to societies, not just our examples being exported, but other examples that are being imported to us. So I wanted to thank you so much for this opportunity. I think from many of us and all of us coming from civil society, very useful conversation. We'd like to continue having these discussions and support you in the work you do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll hand over to the Minister briefly.
Thank you. I just want to step in because I want to try to discourage the question and answer kind of approach. The reason we framed a document like this and call it a framework is because we don't have all the answers. So what would be useful would be maybe some sense of proposals, suggestions, broader than you're doing this, how do you see it being done better, and so on. So I really want to encourage a different approach from the usual kind of discussions we have. I know there's always a temptation wherever I go into a public meeting, everybody wants to kind of bombard you with all these questions, and we don't have all the answers, and it would be useful to kind of have a bit of a different approach. I'm not commenting on the nature of questions that are being posed, but I do feel sometimes that it'd be great to have, participants say, I see it this way. And I think, the International Institute says, we're prepared to host 2 youth seminars because we want to broaden the discussion and we're going to assist in that way. Or someone else says, we're going to convene community meetings to discuss these issues raised by Professor Nkana among South Africans and non-South Africans and others, so that we discuss the meaning of unity and diversity in more concrete terms. So I feel at times an inadequacy of us as South Africans is a reluctance to appropriate our issues, our problems, and our tasks, which are shared. Because for me it's improbable to imagine that a government or even a political party, however mighty it might think it is, that it can be the one that will fully address this fascinating social experiment that is emerging in South Africa post-apartheid. Because that's what we are, an experiment. Trying bold things, trying to create something new. Not really been done successfully before. So how do you play a role? How do you assist? Without really trying to say, there's the manual. What are you going to do about this? For me, it's all of us. So I thought I should just come into kind of maybe stop. I'm not saying don't ask the questions, but it can't solely be that. Because we thought that what we're doing is gathering a bright set of minds for this. This is the start. We're going to have a more public process. We're going to go out there. But we gathered what we thought were some of the best minds. And yesterday, Professor Janet, as you know, I was listening to him, defending, to some degree, the notion of castration. But not defending the practice. Rejecting it, but then saying, at times, difficult contexts may cause one to go to the radical or difficult to come back to what you want to achieve. I may have misinterpreted you, but my sense was you were saying sometimes difficult contexts result in ridiculous notions being put forward, but those ridiculous notions allow you to come to that which may work. And I thought it was a wonderful kind of sense of what we try to do as South Africa. So I think take the chair back with those caveats.
Thank you very much, Minister. Socialization of what we're talking about, I think the Minister said, we would consider an offer from you towards the further discussion on the framework document. I'll come to the lady this side, and then come to my right, and then come back. I've noted there is the side. I'll hand over to you, Madam.
Thank you, Ambassador, Chairperson, Minister, Deputy Minister, Ambassador Chapo, my elder. You can just talk for thank you so much. So, my name is Lusani from the University of Wits. I'm a postgraduate student studying international relations. The way I see it as a young person, Minister, in South Africa, in this aspect of our economic growth beyond our borders is to develop a more nuanced economic foreign policy that is derived not only from the frameworks that one of the speakers mentioned earlier, our 2011 foreign policy paper, papers that are coming in, also from other ministries, the IPAPs, economic planning. We need to converge those documents, frameworks, in order to produce what I argue to be an economic foreign policy, something that does not exist in South Africa right now, so that when you're sitting, Minister, and solving issues of conflict elsewhere, and when South Africa needs to derive economic and peace dividends, knowing which companies should come into the country to rebuild another country, we're able to make decisions on a policy that is based on principles that we have defined for ourselves. Whether those have been defined here at DECO, at DTIC, at the Ministry of Finance, anyone sitting across the table is able to say, according to our economic foreign policy, this is how we can make this decision in terms of peacemaking in the country. That is my offer right now today. That's the first one. Secondly, in trying to, that conversation of having to entertain extremes so that we come back to some form of balanced common ground. To your point, Dr. Steve Lembete, you spoke about how South Africa is now dancing with the idea of right-wing ideologies. Maybe we are showing we are not sure exactly what's attracting, people to that. I think it's very simple and maybe something that we should explore more, that democracy can deliver rule of law, which is something that we need to firm our hand on in South Africa. It feels like we are socialized in our country that anything that looks like it's rule of law, or it's a firm hand on society, it seems like it reminds us of apartheid anxiety. And it shouldn't remind us of apartheid anxiety. I understand, we've been socialized that way, but rule of law must prevail even in a democracy. And so what's attracting people to right-wing ideologies is at least they present some form of societal order that we are needing to encourage, even if we are a democracy. And I think that's one thing that our foreign policy should speak into, so that when other nations look at us, they can say, no, South Africa has rule of law. You can go in there and coexist peacefully with South Africans. My last point, or my last offering to the table, it says that we spoke about, ideological leanings, the framing of essay, Dr. Zoli said, as a progressive internationalist society or nation. First and foremost, we need to look at where our ideologies in the foreign, in the international relations space come from. When the ANC Foreign Policy Making Group set, I think that was somewhere in 1993 or just before 1994, we came and really singled out our identity or ideology on human rights. And that is good, because we had seen what our history had done to us and done to us. But now going forward, for us to be progressive internationally, we are needing to augment above and beyond human rights. We are needing to put economic elements on top of human rights. We are needing to put other ideologies that we know that having added the soft ideologies, what are some of the hard ideologies that we can put forward, into a foreign policy framework that makes us, a progressive internationalist state. You mentioned, Dr. Zoli, South Korea. We started at the same place as South Korea in the 1980s. And the only difference was that South Korea was firm in deciding that we will chase the economy for our society to be progressive and our society to grow, without letting go, obviously, of the soft tenets of their foreign policy, but they were firm in chasing one goal. Thank you so much. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We move to the right.
Thank you. My name is Simon. I just want to start with the premise that it is a well-known fact that the domestic needs determines or are the key drivers of the foreign policy of any country. So then I want to identify 5 needs of this country that I think are concerned. One is the protection of the national sovereignty. 2, the safety and security of citizens home and away. 3, the economic advancement of South Africa, or sustainable economic advancement of South Africa. 4, which I think really are the economic better world for better future. And the last one is development of sustainable human capital. So if those are ideally 5 national interests, the next question would be what tools do we need or means do we need to pursue those 5 interests? I would like to identify diplomacy as one of them, but diplomacy in various contexts in this manner. If we have diplomacy, public diplomacy, we have public diplomacy to pursue certain things that will meet citizens of either that country or this one with other foreign policy issues. And economic diplomacy, The country is in a crisis of human capital. We don't have doctors, but we cannot even go out and have medical diplomas to sort out the skills that we need. In terms of human capital development, the president speaks about fourth generation, before I what is it that other departments are doing to you people who have skills to come into this country and give us that skills we need? The case was for Germany post the collapse of Congo. The other issue on safety and security of South Africans, Mr. General speak, is a question: who is responsible for being South African if America is there somewhere? Who's going to pick me up? Because if Americans, one American, actually Americans can go there if you don't, let alone who's responsible for the security of diplomats. We are in many countries doing development and peace building. One of them. Besides the SNDF and such one case, what is it that we are doing in terms of development? The USA, when it comes here, whatever the amount of bilateral trade with us, 10% of that amount goes to the US aid, which is the good pipeline to other programs that so that what's us to go and develop Zimbabwe and this is because every time it goes on within the context of silencing the guns and whatever it is. Who is assisting the development of human capital? Where can we use unemployed graduates to go and work and build governance institutions in those areas? Like the Canadians have, the Japanese, Canadians, Americans have volunteers, peace movement, but they gain experience by doing by coming. I just also to highlight other issue. The issue of science, technology, and engineering, and mathematics is one of the critical skills that it should be national. The issue of mineral resources, what type of mineral resources we need in this country should the issue within the context of advanced economy, sustainable economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, colleague. I sent suggestions in what you were saying, and I wasn't sure if I understood you to be proposing that we might consider for peace building minister a youth corps, peace corps that we develop and send to those countries. But it was quite a lot that was said. Mr. Siakamena, if I'm seeing correctly, I'm not very my classes. Over to you. And then next to the colleague after you.
Indeed, thank you very much, DDG. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, Minister. My name is Bo Seramela. I was a practitioner of diplomacy for 18 years, amongst others, serving 10 years in the United Nations, seconded by the South African Embassy. I want to align myself to what the Minister said in terms of three proposals. I think the first one I would suggest, excellence, is that we shorten the gap between our civil society, intellectuals, and ourselves as practitioners. Most of the time, the information that is there, the other segments, they don't know. So let us share more information through sessions such as this with our civil society, intellectuals, academics, so that people know more about what South Africa is doing, both internationally and regionally. Secondly, I think I want to propose that we really take advantage of the elders before they depart, including Ambassador Nchapa. I used to enjoy long hours listening rather than engaging in the cafeteria of the United Nations between himself, the late Dumisani Kumar, the late George Nene, when they were arguing amongst themselves, discussing, and they would always warn me that don't say anything, just listen. And I benefited a lot from this. So we have to challenge them, Minister, before they disappear, but they write books. And we should help them because the information that the Excellency, for example, has alluded to now, many of our young people, and I'm not young, I'm 42, even though people think we're young, before anything, let us not praise them when they're born. So I challenge the leadership, even you, Ambassador Diseko, write a book before you give the system. So that's the second proposal. If the issues of resources, I'm sure the Excellency, the Minister, will provide. There are cadets, there are junior officials who will assist in terms of doing the first manuscript. We record the Excellencies, so that's the second proposal. The third proposal, we are not appreciating our practitioners at the practical level. In all our missions, the people who are doing the work is the technocrats, the councillors, the first secretaries and all of that. Let's tap into their knowledge and what we are saying. Most, at least where I said, people who draft resolutions, who negotiate on behalf of our country. These are junior officials. I'm not saying promote them, no, that's not what I'm saying. Let's have their input in whatever that we are doing. And when we drop them in international institutions, let's have them account. Ambassador Diseko knows that I still have a beef. I was deployed to be a senior advisor to the President of the General Assembly for 5 presidents. And I'm still waiting to submit my report and my book in that regard is there. So those will be my proposals, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Siakamela. Let me just capture what you suggested. Many people don't realize that the critical capacity for negotiation for any country are your junior diplomats. They do the heavy lifting, they do betting. They assert the identity of the country. So when you see European diplomats walking en masse, when Russia's constant directors here and foreign service officers, and they cook it until it gets up to the DPR, who guides or until it gets up to the ambassador. The second point that again ties to this one, we need to retain our knowledge, the skill and the culture. We're losing officials that go with capacity. They ought to train and they ought to write. How did we manage the indefinite extension of the NPT? We know how it was achieved, but many of us are off into the sunset. Those that did the Paris Agreement, how did they do it? Only we can teach our diplomats how to negotiate the way in which they should. Brazil is a mechanism for holding that and institutionalizing that and making sure that it's fed into a training. I cannot stress the importance of meeting civil society, how we interact operationally. We need to schedule conversations with civil society, academics, as a matter of course. Not when we meet at conferences on the NPT and here with silent. No, we need to meet and double check, stress the position. This is a suggestion, I think, for me that's vital for national interest. There's a colleague next to you, Mr. Siakamela. Again, please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman, Minister. David Naidu from National Treasury. I thought it might help to locate the discussion within some indicators of success over the last 20 plus years. And I'll rattle through a few statistics, if you don't mind. The first is the GDP per capita. Today it's $7,000 US. In '94 it was 3,500. The GDP today of $350 billion versus $140 billion in '94. And Finally, $2 trillion of taxes collected today versus 113 billion in '94, a factor of 17 times. But notwithstanding that significant growth in the numbers and the statistics, and given the level of unemployment that we have and the huge outflows of capital, maybe perhaps we can locate the national interest discussion and paper and framework in the context of how much further we need to go. By way of comparison, when Singapore started its journey in the 60s, one of their goals was to be recognized as a developed country with a very high per capita income, which today I think is about $60,000. So, I'll be very happy to write this up and submit it as a contribution. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dave. But our caution, though, drawing from what Singapore did, as Singapore was doing the things that they were doing, one of the key things they held on to is their developing country status, which they insist on up to today. So as we chart the progress that we've made, we must hang on to our status as a developing country because of the huge levels of poverty that we still hold, the face of which is black, African and female and young, as Dr. Mete said. Yes, we've made significant strides, but we're still a developing country. There's a lady that side and then we'll move on to the left.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Michela. I am a student at the University of Victoria, currently doing my master's in international relations, specializing in security, specifically security and not say related ways of West Indian Ocean in Africa. And I must say the contributions by all the discussants have been quite illuminating. However, I noted that South Africa's maritime security priorities and its concerns and its maritime identity didn't feature in today's presentations. And my question is, what is South Africa's its position, and by that I mean its interests, its priorities, concerns, and challenges, firstly in the Western Indian Ocean, secondly in the Indian Ocean as a whole, and with the other littoral and island states, and those being the members of the Indian Ocean Rules Association, and thirdly within the wider Indo-Pacific region. And I think it was Mr. Singh who mentioned that South Africa is no longer championing certain nation-building initiatives to the extent that it used to. And perhaps I think we need to explore the possibility of South Africa proposing the creation of an effective cooperative maritime security organization, similar to the Red Sea Council and the ASEAN, one specifically for the Western Indian Ocean region, one which is Africa-centered and Africa-driven, and responds to maritime challenges of African states situated along the Indian Ocean seaboard. And it's not to say that we'll start from scratch, but we'll use what is already there. So we're looking at the African Union Strategic and Integrated Maritime Strategies, and looking at the African Charter on Maritime Security, Safety and Development, as well as the maritime priorities outlined by the SADC and the East African Community. And we would use all this to create a forum which speaks to the evolving security architecture within the region, that's the Western Indian Ocean, especially given the increasing military presence of external actors in the accompanying geopolitical conversation.
Thank you very much, colleague. We struggled to hear you, but from what I heard, I think we need to take down your name so that we can engage with you further on maritime security. And I think that there's a lot of value that we can gain from you. We'll talk to you at lunchtime. Sorry, before we come, Advocate Mashavani, DG of the Department of Justice, a key stakeholder.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you to the Minister and the Department for inviting us to this opportunity to have this interaction. I won't take time, but I want to mention that Minister, we're one of the few countries, I don't know of any other, that at least has been open, or because trade process is an open meeting, and I'm used to recently to close meetings. So my views have become so close that whenever there are cameras, I don't say certain things. But part of what was a debate for some time here was whether we can successfully have a project that seeks to package what we can call national interest. That was one. And I think the idea of having a framework document is a brilliant idea. I don't know how far we are with the case of AfriForum and us engaging Cuba and providing whatever the package of assistance to Cuba. But that's a classical representation of the challenge that we have. And not that we're divided as a country on what we consider to be our national interest. And what has always fascinated many of us was, why is it that modern democracies seem to have some common understanding and appreciation of what their national interest is? Meaning, no matter the changes of governments, you can have a democratic or Republican president, but the definition of what is their national interest remains. The definition of what their security interest is remains. But in this country, if you look over the past 30 years, the decisions that have been taken by the governing party have always been subjected to challenges. And recently, beyond this AfriForum issue, we have seen the utilization of our courts to challenge foreign policy decisions, including the issues around the departure of President al-Bashir from South Africa. And that has been a concern that if we don't have this discussion as a nation to say, who are we, what do we stand for, we are always going to have these challenges. Now, the temptation has always been that when you discuss national interest, it degenerates into a debate about foreign policy. And national interest is not foreign policy. But you cannot have foreign policy without national interest. And I think this process beginning now with the launch of this document provides a good opportunity, one for the academia, but also civil society in broad terms, and the political leaders. I hope that there will also be an opportunity at some point for Parliament to have a debate around this document, so that it must not be seen as an issue of the executive, but it's a broad South African issue, so that even the concerns we had that Dr. Stevie is raising, that you can easily have a government that can change whatever we consider to our grand norm, our constitution, and fundamentally alter our constitutional order. That there will always be that appreciation. And I think for me also the historic capturing of where we come from is very important, Minister. And the point we're making about that aspect of the solidarity, which is what we and the future generation needs to appreciate. And the reality as well is that we don't always have a control of who is busy teaching the students in universities and other areas. I mean, Dr. Sembele might have been like when we were doing Political Science 101, Ambassador Clark was practicing diplomacy and South Africa's foreign policy. So I imagine your assignments and your thesis are full of their names, Kumalo, and many others who have come, before our time. So the point I want to make is that I think there is a real opportunity that South Africa has to engage openly, and this document should be closed so that even those who have other views, there will always be this reality that you say the current governing party looks at its outlook or its consideration of the world is for progressive internationalism. And others in opposition are looking at it from a liberal internationalism point of view. But Minister, you were talking about changing context. These definitions themselves are changing. If you were to ask what is conservative in the US and what is conservative in Britain and what is conservative in South Africa, you will not find a common definition. In this country, if you say what is left, the classical definition will tell you that you can't say you are left when now you are governing. So these are some of the things that if we can appreciate the changing global realities and the conditions to inform, as Minister was saying, our approaches. But most importantly, I think there's always been a contradiction between the domestic realities and how we prosecuted our foreign policy. And now, there is observation, there are many countries that that we know them to be sovereign. They have foreign affairs offices, but they basically cannot prosecute foreign policies. Because the question of policy space is very important. And you can only maintain a policy space. Your ability to maintain a policy space is so much dependent on your domestic capabilities and domestic conditions. So if you have a shrinking fiscus, the economy is not growing, there's no way you can be strong in terms of the prosecution of foreign policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Advocate Yvette, for also inputting on what originally we hoped to accomplish with the document of national interest. And again, I think the more I listen, the more I think maybe that there have to be follow-up conversations, maybe just with sectors. One of the challenges for me was we found ourselves up against predominantly material that was coming up in the media, which were national interest-based negotiation positions of key countries that were raising up outcry about what we sought to achieve. So when we managed to get the first ever special session of the Human Rights Council held to consider the killing of George Floyd, the end point was that we wanted a commission of inquiry. It was the South African media that was outraged about the mere possibility of subjecting the United States of America to that level of accountability. When we read the articles, there were 8 memoirs of the United States of America to African countries saying, you cannot do this to us. It is not appropriate for you to hold us accountable in this manner. Clearly there's a gap. We're not talking to each other not freely, so that we understand the base from which we come from and share information. A telling one for me was when, again, an editorial article appeared. There was verbatim, from beginning to end, an 8 memoir of the United States of America objecting to the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Once you're like that, it actually even incapacitates the continent, cuts it into its common positions. But it can't be that we would be saying at a media level, only the positions of the United States are worthy of consideration. We must build in the face of possible affront or objection. We do need to make the United States of America account for nuclear disarmament and lack of progress. How do we speak a common language? In the United States of America, the opposite is the norm. The American press doesn't understand why South Africa would want the United States of America to shed its nuclear capability. The British media just doesn't understand that on the whole, except media like the Guardian. But how do we understand this? I'm hoping will also close the gap. A big contestation is in the area of human rights and the politics of human rights. It's not clear. It's not a clean field. Everything has to do with national interest. Everything. A good example of it being what is happened in France in the hosting of the visit of a high rights on this case. I will proceed to the left to the lady in the light jacket. And I'm sorry to be saying this, I can't see.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Susanna Caputi. I'm a senior associate of the Latin American and Caribbean Center, part of the Institute of Global Dialogue. I'd just like to make very short points here. I think we haven't really discussed the issue of food security. And I think that's a point which I would really like to bring into the conversation. At the moment, our situation with a few products that I can mention just very short, which are soya, sunflower, and wheat. I think we have to think of a plan. I don't like to talk about subsidies in the same way as Europe structure subsidies for their industries, but I think we have to think of some sort of protection to these industries, because we have left too much the production of these very important products to Ukraine and Russia. And at the moment, we are basically covering about, maybe if we are lucky, 41% of our local consumption. And that's just talking about South Africa, not for the rest of Africa. So we are really heading basically in the next crop for a big deficit in these very important products. So food security, I think it is a South African national interest. The second thing which I would like to bring to the panel is also to look a little bit closer to Latin America and the Caribbean, and perhaps learn the lessons of the region, learn the good lessons, and perhaps take some good points as far as certain legislation in the mining sector, as far as implementing a lot of trade in the regions. And because at the moment, also I think it's a very good case study to see, as Professor Mbeki was saying, this shift that happens in Latin America from right-wing governments to now socialist governments, and all the implications that this brings. It's a very interesting scenario to see at the moment. Chile has basically swung to the socialist side, Bolivia. Brazil, is very right-wing. So to see all those dynamics, how do they actually develop and how do they interact in a region. And the last point, I think, is South Africa's national interest also to try to be more proactive, to try to export more products to the Caribbean, to Latin America and the Caribbean. At the moment, I always hear we are, just eager and thirsty for investors coming to South Africa and deplete our resources, but we don't really think that we have industries here that are desperate to actually sell the products that are providing work and manufacturing. So I think there is a huge market in the Caribbean for pharmaceuticals, for cars and car components. So I really take the offer of Ambassador Pandor to perhaps elaborate more on a proposal. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, colleague. And dear colleagues, remember, you developed this document, so it's being enriched. We're getting feedback from stakeholders, and we will, after this process. So I didn't take any hands from there because I didn't want it to be a repeat of the DMF, as it were. There's a hand this side. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Is that mine? Yeah. All right, thank you. My name is Noah Tansana Mpaga. I am a women's rights activist, but I'm here actually on my capacity as the gender and human rights focal point at the MCU Island here in Pretoria. And just to pick on from the previous speaker, I'm also curious to hear, I didn't hear anything, perhaps when I stepped out briefly, anything being mentioned around the crisis of GBV that we experience in this country, and that's my area of focus. I'm happy to perhaps engage further around kind of that contribution, particularly with young women. Thanks.
Thank you. We look forward to engaging with you as the gender focal point at Irish Embassy, as well as the South African enriching the document. We'll come back to you. We have... Please go ahead.
My name is Itumeleng Kure from the South African Institute of International Affairs, the youth programs, and I'd just like to reiterate on the point on young people and young people being included in the formation of various policies, and not only in young people being involved in discussions, but young people being included and being part and parcel of implementation. Because young people are not only the present, but they also inherit the future. So it is very important for young people to be part and parcel of seeing all the lessons learned through various implementation processes. So whereas it is the policy cycle happening at a horizontal or vertical level, young people are a critical stakeholder in this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do a concluding remarks and the importance will close. Over to you, Mr. Singh.
Thank you, Ambassador. It's been a really insightful, wonderful discussion. I really don't have anything further to add at this point. Maybe just the last parting shots is to say that really the pursuit of our national interest needs to build our capital, our currency on the world stage. And I think that kind of cost benefits analysis should always remain at the back of our head when we craft and look at these positions.
Nothing much, brief point. This is a very contentious issue. There are a lot of interested parties in it. Whatever you say at times will be challenged vigorously, so you should be prepared for that. But I think you must be clear about what national interest is, and the fact that there will be some contestation does not necessarily mean that we have to change. We have to stand your ground, and that's the nature of global politics. A lot of contribution stuff and vested interest. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Prof.
Thank you very much. Thanks for what you suggested. In response to what the minister was urging us to do, let me suggest the following. When I suggest that this was an inaugural symposium, it was not a symposium. So this was an inaugural symposium because it was justified its value for a repeat. Then the second one is that there is room working with others, including Parliament, for public engagement in communities. DECO has been very adept at doing those, going to communities, maybe partner with an institution that can host the university and center, whatever, closer to communities and townships and stuff like that. Public engagement in communities, including a specific aim to engage communities where you have non-South African Africans together with South Africans, to really converse with them and debate with each other and all that. Because as Mthebisi said, you can't protest the issue away. So you need to have conversations that are able to distinguish between the problematic people and people who really are just desperate as everybody is. The third one, I suggest that there is a great opportunity right now for social compacting in this area. And one way of doing that is to engage with South African businesses that are trading abroad but that are in the country. Those are actually involved here. Think about, I saw the tweets this morning about MTN trying to do certain things in Nigeria because it knows it has to be very fearful about the consequences are the changes for the Catalans. But I don't know. They may actually have ideas about what we could do together and do better. Or we may be wrong. but perhaps discover during those conversations some project discussion. The third, next suggestion is that I think there's a precious opportunity to work with youth formations, including with NYDA. Perhaps in their initiative on their side, and engagement with how youth agency participation could be enhanced. There is definitely, I don't know, I'm advocate, you were in the US posted there for a while, and I keep wondering, why do they have this structured engagement with foreign correspondents? They don't let that slide. What is that for occupation with that? In South Africa, there's a growing number of foreign correspondents, by the way, after a time when there was a lot. Both of South African media organizations that are foreign correspondents and foreign correspondents who are based in South Africa. Often they think we are reluctant to engage, but perhaps we didn't notice it. We don't hate them, but we're not hostile. Or also, we don't have confidence in convention. And I think they might be a good idea of having a foreign correspondent in the open conversation without anything. And lastly, in line with the National Development Plan, we need to enhance evidence-based public policy making, of course, generally in government, but that might involve partnering with research capability in South Africa heads. Ambassador I always wonder whether South Africa realizes that it has so much research capacity that universities that we have in South Africa, we don't have a private university like the 2 or 3. All of them are public universities, which means they are your asset. Not something out there. We've already paid for it. Society has already paid for that. It's in their duty. They even put it in their own strategic plan to be platforms of sharing thoughts and stuff. Sometimes they don't know what to research for, which is of policy interest. Instead of just thinking about what is of policy interest and then throw it at, you go and say, no, we need to research this. We need to fully understand this sort of open. We didn't understand what an entry point. Isolate the regressive and progressive elements of it. But universities are a national asset. All children, they should be, in my view, should partner, and together with other institutes and centers, to generate even basic things like every 2 years, what has been done, what has not been done, and what are some audit sort of, because they could actually inform the discussions of the annual symposium. The analysis doesn't become an open-ended opinion-making thing only, but also respond to a specific thing that is being done. Just recently, the Friends South Africa released the Global Reputation Summit. And there was a very interesting thing. And they do it in this area as well. And I apologize that an important part of that, it's also in the LGP, is to enhance research capacity at level. I'm going to say it, and we said it before, we need to enhance that research capacity at the economy. In Brazil, some of us were in Brazil, and you see how they use the IPEA, it's called IPEA, as IPEA, as a central generator of information, very interface between practitioners and thinkers out there. All ever generating ideas, and I think the idea of responsibility will protect it. And many ideas they do, including the environment. The first environment summit came from the internal. I think South Africa has got to a point where it's matured enough to have a fully fledged environment. I really see us now. Thanks.
Thanks, Dr. Zodi. Foreign correspondence, but we would have to begin with the media here, just a free-flowing engagement, as distinct from a briefing coverage. Sessions where we meet to look at specific issues and the work. Then we take foreign correspondence separately or jointly.
Thank you, Ambassador. Just two last points for me, because I think everything else has been so ably covered by my colleagues. The first is just to the question that we must go away with and constantly asking is who are we and what are our interests. I found it so interesting, Ambassador Drago speaking about Ujola Bamindi, and that's not taught in schools anymore. There's a whole history about where we come from, who we are, that we don't teach. And so, and that then leads to my second point, and the point that I want to leave with is that it strikes me sitting here at DOGO that this is actually a cross-sectoral document. It isn't a DOGO document, it's an education department document, it's a Department of Water Affairs document, it's an environmental affairs document, and I think that there needs to be, and leaving it to you as officials and as government leaders, that this is a document that needs to be engaged with across government. It is to be brought alive in the way it is intended to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mbete. That then concludes the section of respondents and interactions, and I will now hand over to the Minister to do her concluding remarks. Over to you.
Ministers always have the hardest job. But let me begin by thanking the panelists and all of you for the really excellent contributions that have been made. I think, as we expected, the panelists have made us think. And we will look at the document with fresh eyes, having heard everyone today. And we do undertake that the public engagement will be brought under just this symposium, because I do think that we need to go out there because we make assumptions that we have shared perspectives as a nation. We don't communicate with each other sufficiently and allow for the setting out of our various perspectives, and maybe the attempt to develop a more synthesized set of notions as the South African people. I think, Chairperson, maybe if the Ukraine-Russia conflict had broken out before we finalized the paper, a different framework document would have been developed. The part on the challenges presented by the emerging global context might have been very different. The element that we had in the past, in the context of the Cold War, of global bullying, has become very prevalent in the current situation. I am your diplomat who's out there in the world, and I can't remember how many times I've had to defend myself in many settings where the posture that has been adopted by South Africa is questioned by both friend and foe. And often there's an attempt to say, but you must take a position as South Africa. Because we took a position on your struggle. And I have struggled to identify how what is happening today is similar to the anti-apartheid struggle. I've even been confronted in the context of media interviews where a journalist, a young interviewer interviewing me, said, we supported your struggle. Why can't you support the people of Ukraine? So I said to him, well, indeed it's true. And we have acknowledged the worldwide support for the struggle against apartheid. But I do wish to remind you that countries in Europe didn't give us arms, but the Russians did. That doesn't mean that what is happening with respect to the people of Ukraine is something we would support. But there is a distinction in the relationship. And by the way, Ukraine was part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and that was part of those who trained us and gave us arms. And so when we call for peace, we recognize the complex situation that faces the country with the experiences of South Africa. But it's become a situation where you are dealt with in a very patronizing ways. For example, why didn't you support this particular resolution? And you say, well, the resolution is drafted by certain countries in a room, and then they give it to you to consider for support. And you go back to the drafters and say, we wish to propose a change to this paragraph. And the exact words of the drafter are, you take it or leave it. Now, as a country, how are you expected to respond in the affirmative in such a situation? When you're saying there's just not one panel, and you're told you take it or leave it. I can't accept being dealt with in that way. And I can't accept it by a friend. I don't accept it by anybody. There are countries that are our friends that come with particular views in the form of resolutions. And I've been able to say to them, in terms of our constitution and our policy, I can't support that. And they may say, but South Africa, this, you are a friend, that, sorry. And that is influenced by this notion we have of who we are. I just, in conclusion, very quickly want to say, well, with respect to the references that are always made to South Korea and Ghana, 1961 or something, I think I often see this in a lot of literature. I think one of the things that's neglected is the reality that massive support was given to South Korea. Huge capital, infrastructure and other forms of investment, and we neglect to refer to that. We talk of Germany and its recovery post-Second World War. Again, you had a Marshall Plan. South Africa has had the experience of apartheid. And post-apartheid, there's been no Marshall Plan by those who were very strongly supportive of South Africa in the time of racist oppression. So I think we should always look at what are the measures that have led to the developments that we refer to, and are they the same for every part of the world? I wish intellectuals were really briefing all of us much more about the role of colonial countries in modern Africa today. Do countries control their finances? What are their finances used for? Where are their finances banked? South Africa is a little different in that we've been a bit cheeky. But the situation is disastrous. It's horrendous in many parts of our continent. And we need as South Africa to focus on being well, in a growing economy, in having an ability to support development on the African continent, but make sure our democracy works. We must advance good governance, because our success is absolutely vital for the success of Africa. If South Africa fails, the context of our continent will be more than dismal. And I'm not saying that from a point of arrogance, it's a reality. I then want to say that, Mr. Naidu, I do agree with what you said of the changes in the economy of South Africa, its growth, but the benefits of that growth are not evenly spread, and this is the dilemma of inequality in South Africa, because while we've had those massive per capita GDP changes, these have not translated into less poverty. So we need to really do much more about examining both distribution of national revenue and real change to the economic structure of South Africa. And I think greater attention, in my view, to formalizing micro and small industries so that they have the ability to earn people real livelihoods. So there's a need for that growing GDP to make a more impactful contribution to economic infrastructure that supports the vulnerable and the marginalized, who are in survivalist business, industry, business sectors that enjoy very little formal support. This is a challenge, I think, our government and our country, supported by the private sector, which is extremely rich, needs to pay attention to. The matter of the Cuban case is still with the courts. It's, for me now, less about Cuba and our intention to provide humanitarian support and more about executive power. We now have a problem of drought in Madagascar. We were hoping to assist them, but we don't know whether we have to go to the judge to get permission because the judge stopped us doing something, or do we still have the executive freedom to take an executive decision? It's unclear given the current judgment. So we are appealing because we believe there's an unconstitutional element to the decision that has been handed down. We also were dismayed at the attempt to pretend to the public that we were taking away resources from poverty programs in South Africa, poverty alleviation programs in South Africa, because there's budget allocation in our country and budgets are directed toward particular purposes. I also think it's important that interlocutors in our country pay attention to what some of these so-called civil society organizations are doing to South Africa's reputation and standing in the international community and multilateral bodies. I was very surprised earlier this year to be told in Geneva by a commissioner of the Human Rights Commission that we are accused of racism due to farm murders, as though farm murders are being committed by government according to civil society organization from South Africa. It has tabled this accusation and allegation. Also, policy on land redistribution, and particularly expropriation without compensation, has been cited as a further example of the racism of South Africa. And it's now in the international domain unchallenged. So we also need to look at those who appropriate progressive notions of organs of civil society for very, very conservative and racist approaches. I think I agree with the colleague who is essentially from Latin America and is working at the Institute for Global Dialogue, that we have to pay attention to African resilience. We saw what happened to the continent when vaccines were first produced against COVID-19. We were last in line. Now we've got the matter of wheat and sunflower oil. Again, we are last in line. We have to make more of African resilience and self-sufficiency. These are real economic opportunities that the African continent should take up and develop independence of. We discussed this matter of food security at the last meeting of the African Union, the midterm review meeting. And we agreed that we've got to do something. You can't have world crises and Africa is the victim. And what has happened now, the discourse around Ukraine, Russia, has begun to say, Africa, this is your problem. You must take a stand because you are affected by food insecurity and so on. So we really need to make more of African resilience and reduce this dependence that we still have. The framework speaks to all the issues that have been referred to in this meeting. The need for skills diversity, the need for international opportunities for young people, which I think we don't use enough. The need to ensure that our natural resources are carefully looked after in order to protect our environment for future generations. We also need to pay attention to responsiveness to climate change challenges, and I think the just transition partnership that we are working on is part of that response by South Africa, but all of us must give attention to its detail and exactly what the implications are, both in terms of financial resources, but also for that sustainability. I think the matter of the ocean economy, but ocean security is absolutely important. We do have a maritime security strategy, and of course our South African Navy is playing a very important role in parts of the southern Indian Ocean, but I think it's an area we need to strengthen. We do have loss of fish, for example, through piracy, and some of our Indian Ocean routes are utilized for significant criminal syndicate activity, especially drugs smuggling, poaching, and other crime, human trafficking. So I think there is a need to expand the ocean security dimension of the work of South Africa, but it's not my obligation. It rests with my colleagues in the defense and security sector. I think all of us recognize much more should be done. We refer to digital technology, which hasn't been mentioned here. Cybersecurity is a major threat, as we all know, because financial transactions, transport, logistics can all be brought to a standstill should we have a cyber attack. So the matter of digital is very, very significant, and it is referred to in our document. The document also speaks to matters of gender and the challenge we have in the continent of women, peace and security, and violence against women. But having read it again, I feel we weren't as robust on gender as we should have been. And it may be something we give fuller attention to in the future. I think on the matter of BRICS and Russia and China, and of course Brazil is part of BRICS, as is India, my lesson in the last 3 years in this office is that we recognize that there are times where our interests coalesce very strongly, but there are times where there is contention or opposition between us from time to time. When it happens, I don't go and say it in the public domain, because that's not the practice of diplomacy. Diplomacy doesn't mean public posture. But do know that in various fora, I am engaging in battles on our behalf. Might not be public, but it happens from time to time. And where, as I said, I can't cite an example, but where it's just not acceptable, I refuse. And I'm steadfast, and colleagues know. We've had one case, and a colleague minister, where I resisted. He recently came to speak to me and said, we made the change you wanted, are you happy now? And I said, yeah, no, I'm satisfied. So there are times when they collide, and we have to act on behalf of our country. On the continent, I still feel South Africa needs a rigorous, well-crafted Africa strategy. And I think what is important as well is for us in our different sectors to initiate discussions and debates on ideological postures of ourselves on the African continent. I think we need to do this in the African Union to develop greater alignment or shared understanding in multilateral fora and other institutions. Most embarrassing, for example, for us to be postulating solidarity with the people of Palestine. And the very organization we're a member of proposes that Israel should become an observer in our organization. Most peculiar. So we just need to stop acting with the mindset that appears to assume we all have shared notions of the global tasks that confront us. I agree with Prof. Zondi on enhancing research capacity in the department. It's something we are discussing. Unfortunately, the economic hazards of the past few years have caused us to put in the back burner many plans that we had, for example, a diplomatic academy, a strong research unit. We don't have the resources to do all those things. We're in deficit in terms of our salary bill every year. And so I really have said one of the things we must focus on is looking at how do we help South Africa achieve its economic objectives so that we might get more resources from public revenue. And this is the focus that we have. Finally, on parties in Parliament, I don't think we have shared perspectives on all matters in the international domain. For example, in Palestine, there's a huge difference. There are some parties that agree, and there are others that don't. On Cuba, there are parties that will call for sanctions on Russia, but have no problem with the blockade that Cuba has experienced for more than 60 years. So, we do have, I think, different perspectives and approaches, and it's worrying that we do, because human suffering is human suffering, and you need, to hold up the interests of others, whoever they may be. Of course, I know we've had the embarrassing positions with respect to Myanmar and votes in the UN, some of those challenges that we have had in the past, which I believe will continue sometimes to be a challenge. But I think, given this framework document, we now have a clear guide as to how we are expected to conduct our foreign policy and practice. Chairperson, I think let me stop there. I know that Deputy Minister Botus is going to give us a good word. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Minister. I will now hand over to DM Botus to close the meeting.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, Minister, panelists, diplomats, IR scholars, and members of the fourth estate. The framework document on national interest, quite correctly, colleagues, will seek to complement the implementation of South Africa's foreign policy imperatives, which are pivoted on Pan-Africanism, global South solidarity, deepening of cooperation with the more industrialized North, and of course the strengthening of multilateralism and enhanced participation in global governance. Cabinet has directed the Minister of Turbo to engage in a substantive process of dialogue, ladies and gentlemen, in relation to the contents of this particular document. And it is my submission that today it's an important building block. We expect that members of civil society will continue to engage and request our participation in your engagement process so that we will be able to provide comprehensive feedback to the Cabinet and our President. Importantly, ladies and gentlemen, we do recognize that this national interest document puts reasonable constraints on the conduct of government as and when we implement our foreign policy. I think the Minister have evidently indicated that when our foreign policy, for example, speaks about deepening of multilateralism and enhanced participation of global governance issues, the national interest directs us to then act in accordance to that interest. So you are necessarily not going to have a situation, ladies and gentlemen, where we remove ourselves from the proximity of multilateral organizations, for example, because we are directed by this very important national interest document. Secondly, it is a public statement of our declaration and our interests as a cabinet, and it allows us to be more predictable to both our friends and to our foes, ladies and gentlemen. So that as we engage in the implementation of our foreign policy objectives, our friends and foes will appreciate the opportunities of deepening partnership with South Africa and the constraints which we face with. Thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, we do recognize that this framework provides a very ideal opportunity for civil society with pertinent criteria to evaluate the implementation of the foreign policy of the South African government. So we do invite a very critical assessment in relation to how we conduct our foreign policy. For example, I think the Minister has raised that when South Africa do utilize its resources at its disposal and work with specific interventions on food security, for example in Zimbabwe, South Sudan, etc., it should be benchmarked on our foreign policy. What does the foreign policy imperatives of South Africa says in relation to those issues? As you speak about Pan-Africanism, what is the subtext as it relates to our national interest is concerned? Minister, we should appreciate and acknowledge a very substantive role that we think non-state actors has in foreign policy. This has been recognized by I have scholars as far back as 1970. So international organizations, multinational corporations, and civil society and NGOs ordinarily pursue their goals independent of the state, ladies and gentlemen. Sometimes these goals go hand in hand with the policy imperatives of the South African government, but more than often in conflicts with our foreign policy imperatives. So our submission as government is that non-state actors can be valuable allies, but they can equally hamper the implementation of our foreign policy objectives. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, we do make a submission that we are conscious that we execute our foreign policy in a world that is more volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous. But we do anticipate that this framework document of South Africa's national interest will serve as an enabler for us to better devise strategies to effectively counter balance volatility with vision, uncertainty with understanding, complexity with clarity, and ambiguity with certainty. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deputy Minister. Then what remains of me is to thank the Minister for the wisdom of having this event and also playing a critical part in it, and to thank the Deputy Minister. I'm also grateful to the presenter for taking time out to come and engage with us. And above all, I'm thankful that you all came and the room is full and you participated. This is the beginning, as Professor Zondi said, it's an inaugural session. We will have other sessions and to follow up. This would have been possible without public diplomacy. I am grateful to Division Miela and a team and the Director General who's not here today, and we wish you well. With that, I want to stand between you and lunch. We are an hour late already, I think.